Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal in the most devastating and misguided moment of her life, Willow lost everything she had ever fought for. She had clung to the fragile belief that her relationship with Michael was irrevocably broken, that the fissures between them had grown too wide to bridge. Instead of trying to repair what was damaged, instead of choosing healing and redemption, she sought solace in the arms of Drew, a man she once saw as her emotional sanctuary. But what began as a desperate attempt to find comfort quickly transformed into an all-consuming nightmare from which there was no escape. The affair not only cost her Michael's trust and love but stripped her of the very essence of her identity as a mother. She was cut off from Wiley, her connection to him severed by court orders and emotional estrangement. The situation was made worse by her own spiraling actions. Chief among them, the harrowing plan to abduct Daisy, the child of Michael and Sasha, in a moment of psychological unraveling fueled by the grief of losing Wiley. It was a secret she had buried deep within her conscience, convinced it would never resurface. But Drew, the man she had once confided in and leaned on, unearthed that secret with ruthless precision. What shattered Willow the most wasn't the exposure of her darkest intentions, but the realization that Drew had become the very thing she had once escaped from. His cold, calculating demeanor mirrored the psychological manipulation she endured under Shiloh's control years ago, only now, it was far more insidious because she had chosen it. She had walked into the trap, believing it to be shelter. And now Drew was using her past. Her trauma, her mental health struggles, and the lingering scars of desperation, as weapons to control her every move. The betrayal felt like an endless series of incisions into an already raw soul. Drew confronted her not with loud anger, but with icy determination, threatening to expose everything, the text messages outlining her obsession with Daisy, the voice notes laced with longing and instability, the surveillance images that painted her as a woman on the edge. His goal was clear. If he couldn't have her, he would destroy her. He vowed she would never see Wiley again. He swore that if she didn't submit to his control, he would ensure her psychological history became public record in a custody battle she could never win. But fate, in its unpredictable cruelty, offered a sliver of redemption. It came from the very person Willow believed she had lost forever, Wiley. During a rare, supervised visit, Wiley, still longing for the warmth of his mother's embrace, shared fragments of conversations and moments that no child should have witnessed. He spoke innocently of Drew's repeated visits to the house, of strange late-night phone calls, of hushed voices and angry threats he overheard from behind the stairs. Michael, initially skeptical but unable to ignore his son's vivid memories, began to connect the dots. Quietly, he arranged for a review of the security footage from the Quartermain estate. What surfaced was damning. Hidden recordings captured Drew lurking in hallways, making covert calls, and even directly threatening Willow during moments she thought were private. The evidence was indisputable. Drew had been stalking, coercing, and emotionally blackmailing Willow for weeks, attempting to force her back into his arms through fear and guilt, using the pain of Daisy and Wiley as leverage. When Willow learned that it was Wiley's courage and innocence that brought the truth to light, she was overwhelmed by a complex storm of grief, gratitude, and maternal love. Tears flooded her eyes as she held her son tightly for the first time in months, realizing that even in his young heart, the bond between them had never truly broken. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Willow saw a light at the end of the suffocating tunnel. Michael, now fully aware of the truth, no longer looked at her with suspicion. The doubt and distance that had once clouded his judgment were gone. With urgency and fierce resolve, he assembled a legal team and brought the entire case to court, determined to not only protect his son but to shield Willow from the manipulative shadow that had nearly consumed her. The court acted swiftly. Drew was arrested, and during an emergency hearing, the full extent of his violations was revealed. He was charged with criminal intimidation, invasion of privacy, unlawful surveillance, and attempted coercion connected to Willow's psychological instability. Although Willow's initial intention to abduct Daisy was presented in court, she was spared criminal charges after voluntarily coming forward and proving that her actions were driven by emotional trauma, not malice. Nevertheless, the psychological toll Drew had inflicted upon her was undeniable. She stood in that courtroom not just as a victim, but as a survivor, haunted, yes, but no longer helpless. Drew, once a man respected by many in Port Charles, was exposed for who he had truly become, a manipulator driven by vengeance and control. The very community that had once welcomed him now turned its back in collective disgust. His incarceration was not just a legal consequence but a societal exile. Behind bars, he no longer had power. No access, no leverage, no way to twist emotions or secrets to his advantage. His threats evaporated, and with them, Willow's chains began to loosen. But healing is never immediate. Willow would carry the weight of what she had nearly become, a woman so broken by grief that she almost sacrificed another child's safety. She understood now the importance of facing her own darkness, of seeking help not out of fear but out of courage. Therapy became her sanctuary. She journaled each night, reliving the chaos not to torment herself but to reclaim control over her narrative. And slowly, through shared visits and open communication, she began to rebuild her relationship with Wiley. She didn't expect Michael to forget, nor did she demand forgiveness, but his presence and willingness to listen became a balm to wounds that once seemed incurable. Nina, too, became a distant figure. Though she had once hoped to play a maternal role in Willow's life, her silence during Drew's descent into darkness had made her complicit. Whatever trust Willow had in her biological mother dissolved. There were no confrontations, no dramatic declarations, just a quiet understanding that their paths were no longer meant to align. Willow chose instead to focus on what remained true, her son, her healing, and her hard-won clarity. In the end, Willow didn't just survive Drew. She dismantled his power piece by piece. She reclaimed her voice. And though the scars from that harrowing chapter would always linger, they became reminders of her resilience, not her ruin. What she had once believed was the end of everything had become the beginning of something far greater, her rebirth. Drew's descent into legal and psychological ruin was swift and absolute. After the revelation of his manipulative behavior, illegal surveillance, and attempts to control Willow through intimidation and blackmail, the court moved decisively. Given the gravity of the charges, including attempted coercion, unlawful surveillance, psychological harassment, and his role in exacerbating Willow's emotional instability, Drew was not granted bail. The judge cited him as a significant danger to others and himself, ordering immediate placement in a secure psychiatric detention facility pending formal trial. What followed was a stunning fall from grace for a man once perceived as principled, compassionate, and emotionally grounded. The sterile walls of the psychiatric ward became his new prison, and the silence within them began to dismantle whatever delusions of control he once held. Inside the institution, Drew wrestled with the unreality of his circumstances. It defied belief that the carefully constructed image he had projected for years had crumbled in a matter of days. In his mind, he had been justified, he had believed he was protecting something sacred, preserving a bond with Willow that she herself refused to acknowledge. But the evidence told another story, one of surveillance, coercion, threats, and a spiraling fixation that culminated in mental and emotional abuse. His obsession with Willow festered in isolation, mutating into a warped sense of ownership and vengeance. In moments of clarity, he recognized the grotesqueness of his actions, but those flashes were brief and drowned out by his overwhelming sense of betrayal. He felt betrayed by Willow for exposing him, by Nina for distancing herself, and even by Michael for choosing forgiveness over condemnation. His obsession became his only constant, a flame that refused to extinguish even in the numbing cold of confinement. But outside those walls, life was not standing still. Willow, though still reeling from the trauma, was slowly reclaiming fragments of her identity and dignity. The legal victory that saw Drew removed from her life brought with it not celebration, but a quiet, bittersweet relief. The scars, emotional, psychological, and spiritual, remained raw, but the absence of Drew's looming presence allowed her space to breathe again. She was no longer reacting to threats, no longer navigating each day in fear of what might be uncovered or manipulated. She could now live her truth with courage and accountability. Though she did not have full custody of Wiley, Michael's attitude had softened. His anger had dissolved into understanding, and his coldness into guarded compassion. He allowed more frequent visits, creating opportunities for mother and son to rebuild the relationship they had both been denied. Each encounter with Wiley was a moment of healing. Willow approached their time together with humility and reverence, no longer trying to prove herself as a perfect mother but instead embracing her imperfections and focusing on presence. She helped him with homework, listened to his dreams, and cherished his laughter. Not as a balm to her wounds, but as a source of genuine joy. Wiley responded with a warmth that reassured her the bond between them, though strained, had not been severed. His affection, unconditional and pure, became the foundation upon which she rebuilt her hope. Yet not all relationships in Willow's life found such redemption. Her connection with Nina remained irreparably damaged. Though Nina had once reached out, offered comfort, and pleaded for reconciliation, her silence during Drew's manipulation had left a wound that could not be easily healed. To Willow, silence was not neutrality, it was complicity. Nina had seen the red flags, heard the whispers, sensed the danger, but chose to protect her own interests instead of shielding her daughter. That choice severed the fragile thread of trust they had begun to weave. Willow did not hate Nina. In many ways, that would have been easier. Instead, she regarded her with a detached sorrow, as one might feel toward a stranger who once wore the mask of family. She no longer called her mom, no longer entertained Nina's attempts to connect. She set boundaries, not as punishment, but as preservation. In the meantime, Willow immersed herself in the slow, disciplined work of self-recovery. Therapy became her anchor. With a dedicated counselor, she unpacked the layers of trauma stretching back to her time with Shiloh, through Harmony's manipulations, and culminating in her toxic entanglement with Drew. She faced her darkest decisions, including the haunting plan to abduct Daisy, not with defensiveness, but with raw honesty. She no longer blamed her circumstances, but sought to understand how grief, loneliness, and emotional instability had driven her to such extremes. It was through this process that she began to rebuild the shattered pieces of her psyche, not as a return to the woman she once was, but as the emergence of someone wiser, more grounded, and fiercely committed to truth. Willow also began documenting her journey through writing. Her journals, once filled with anguish and confusion, now served as testaments to her strength and accountability. Each entry was a vow to herself and her son. That she would never again surrender her agency for the illusion of love or security. Her words, raw and unfiltered, began to shape something greater, a purpose. She contemplated one day sharing her story publicly, perhaps as a speaker or advocate for women who had experienced psychological abuse masked as affection. But for now, her focus remained inward, her circle small, and her goals personal. Michael, though still healing himself, became a quiet supporter. Their co-parenting dynamic matured into something that resembled cautious friendship. They did not dwell on the past, nor did they make promises about the future. But there were glimmers, shared memories revived during conversations with Wiley, long silences that no longer felt hostile, but reflective. If reconciliation was ever to come, it would not be rushed. Willow respected that. She no longer chased after lost time or idealized love. Instead, she cultivated a life that was simple, honest, and grounded in growth. Meanwhile, Drew's fate remained sealed in the halls of justice and isolation. As the trial date approached, his legal team attempted to craft a narrative of diminished capacity and emotional breakdown, hoping to lessen his sentence. But the prosecution's evidence was overwhelming, and public sympathy for him had long since evaporated. Port Charles moved on without him. His name became a cautionary whisper, his presence erased from boardrooms and social circles alike. Even Nina, once a potential ally, had distanced herself, unwilling to jeopardize her fragile standing in the community further. Drew had become a ghost in his own life, haunted by choices that had destroyed not only his freedom, but any legacy he hoped to leave behind. For Willow, however, the future stretched ahead, not without pain, but with possibility. She had survived the storm and emerged stronger not because she was untouched by it, but because she had faced it head-on. She no longer needed validation, no longer feared judgment. Her focus was singular, being the mother Wiley deserved and the woman she had always wanted to be. With each passing day, she learned that healing did not mean forgetting, it meant forgiving herself, accepting her scars, and choosing love over fear again and again. And in that choice, made daily, Willow finally began to live. Willow's battle was never destined to end with a single act of defiance or in the cold finality of a courtroom sentence. It was a journey that unfolded with aching slowness, a war of emotional reclamation fought inch by inch through memories, trauma, and self-doubt. She had once been a woman who allowed the tide of other people's will to shape her life, first Harmony's, then Shiloh's, and eventually Drew's. Each of them, in their own way, had sought to own her story, to rewrite her worth through manipulation, coercion, and the exploitation of her deepest vulnerabilities. But in the wake of Drew's downfall, something shifted. The narrative no longer belonged to those who had wounded her. For the first time, it belonged to Willow. When Drew was formally sentenced and committed to a psychiatric institution without the possibility of bail, a profound stillness followed. The news reverberated across Port Charles with shock and disbelief, but Willow didn't find satisfaction in his punishment. The man who had once professed to love her had been swallowed by his obsession, and what remained was a shell of instability and rage. Within the secure walls of the mental health facility, Drew existed in a suspended reality, increasingly consumed by his own delusions. He refused to believe he had lost. In his mind, Willow had betrayed him, turned him over to the very justice system he once pretended to uphold. His feelings for her twisted into a volatile cocktail of desire, hatred, and desperation, an illusion he clung to, even as the walls of his confinement closed in tighter. He replayed moments with her over and over, editing them in his head until he could convince himself she had once loved him, had once belonged to him. The dangerous intensity of his fixation grew even more feral in captivity. But it was powerless now. His words, once weapons, now fell into the void unheard. His reach, once wide and suffocating, was now severed. Meanwhile, Willow was writing a new chapter, one born not of vengeance or vindication, but of healing and personal rebirth. Every morning she woke in a home that no longer echoed with fear. The absence of Drew's shadow meant she could finally breathe, deeply and fully, without the gnawing anxiety of waiting for the next threat or manipulation. But peace did not come immediately. At night, she still flinched at unexpected sounds. She still double-checked locks, still fought against intrusive thoughts. Trauma had etched itself into her nervous system. And so, healing became her daily labor, a sacred task she undertook with solemn determination. She returned to therapy with fierce commitment, unpacking the layers of trauma she had long buried beneath politeness and appeasement. She no longer feared naming her abusers. She no longer minimized her suffering. She learned that her scars did not make her weak, they were evidence that she had survived. Through therapy, she came to understand how years of emotional abuse had taught her to doubt her instincts, to silence her voice, to confuse control for love. And she swore to herself, again and again, that her son would never grow up mistaking fear for affection. Her journey was not linear. There were setbacks, days when the pain felt too vast, when the guilt for nearly kidnapping Daisy overwhelmed her, when the memories of Michael's disappointment made her curl in on herself. But each time she fell, she stood again. Her bond with Wiley became both her compass and her lifeline. Every moment with him was a quiet revolution. She no longer clung to him in desperation, she no longer saw him as her redemption. Instead, she simply loved him, tenderly, patiently, without condition. She listened to him talk about school, helped him tie his shoes, and laughed when he told silly stories. These small acts became the foundation of trust, the bridge across the chasm that had once separated them. And Wiley, with the open heart only children possess, accepted her with grace and forgiveness. In his eyes, she wasn't a broken woman. She was just Mom. Michael, too, changed. At first, his demeanor remained cool and guarded. He had been burned, by her affair with Drew, by her emotional unraveling, by the chaos that followed. But as he watched Willow show up consistently and vulnerably, something within him softened. He saw how she was no longer blaming others or hiding behind excuses. He saw her do the work, real, grueling, relentless work, to become a better mother, a more whole person. Their co-parenting became fluid and respectful. They spoke more often, first about Wiley, then about life. Occasionally, he would linger after a visit, sitting with her in the kitchen over tea, discussing childhood memories, laughing in the way they once did before things fell apart. There was no promise of reconciliation, but there was something even more valuable, mutual respect. And in that, Willow found peace. Still, not all relationships could be salvaged. Her bond with Nina remained fractured beyond repair. Though Nina had once extended love and even fought for her in court, her silence during Drew's manipulation was unforgivable. Nina had known something was wrong, had seen the signs, had witnessed Willow's withdrawal, but said nothing. Whether out of fear or pride, Nina had chosen inaction. To Willow, that silence had been betrayal.